Good afternoon. In this lecture, what I want to talk about is a bit about the background for those of us who are working at the Institute for Human Security and Social Change to understand how we approach field practice and some of the reasons and influences that have brought us to think about both social change and about the practice of engaging in that social change process. And so one of the important places that we start with when we're starting to try and make sense of this notion of change is to understand that the world is a complex place, and complexity has a range of meanings and ways of defining it. But it's this notion that change is not a simple process of moving from one point in history or time or group of people to another, but that there are many factors that move change in different directions and many influences. And if we're going to engage in this process as aid and development workers, if we're wanting to influence social change, whether it's here in Australia or overseas, understanding this notion of complexity and what it means and our place in all of that is really important to then thinking about how we do that effectively. So let's unpack this notion a little bit more. So this is one way of thinking about some of what people see as the key aspects of change that we need to come to terms with in order to then think about why maybe traditional approaches to aid and development, which assume a simpler world, perhaps are less adequate. One is, as I said, that change is complex, and by that basically we mean that change involves people, and it involves systems and interactions of people. And once you get more than one person and one system and one organisation and the interactions between them, those become multiplied and unable to be mapped or controlled. This is not a scientific experiment where you can understand the simple connection between A and B. Once you start engaging with multiple people and their multiple interactions, then it becomes impossible to completely map or understand. People talk about problems and issues in the world also being wicked, and that term's an interesting term, but basically what it means is the problems change and develop as you start to work on them. They don't stay the same. It's not about this is what we're going to do and this is the solution to that problem and it'll be the same solution and the same problem in a year's time. Actually, the problem evolves and change. Further, that problems and issues are now global and interconnected. So when you think about it, think about some of the issues that you might need to deal with or that people might need to deal with across the world. Issues like climate change, issues like youth unemployment, major diseases. They're problems that spread across boundaries. It's no longer about what is the problem in this country or in this part of the country, but they exceed what any one nation state can deal with. And certainly the international conventions and governance arrangements are not up to dealing with some of those big problems. And then finally, a lot of the problems that we have to deal with are about attitudes and behaviours, and they're shaped by beliefs and people's ideals and voices and notions and their history and culture. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. So it's not necessarily something that I, sitting in Australia, coming from a white middle-class background, are necessarily even going to begin to understand, much less to have the solutions to those problems. So when we're dealing with traditional aid and development, which essentially works on what's known as a transactional model, it's here we have a set of resources, whether they money or capacities or people, and we're going to transfer them over to a problem situation in another country, and that's going to solve that situation largely by making it more like what we understand to be the way things should operate. That transactional model just breaks down in the face of how we understand problems and therefore the change arrangements related to them. Just using one example to try and make some sense of this is this notion of inequality. So for many years, traditional aid and development work thought about inequality as us being in rich countries, us in Australia or in so-called Western and developed countries, and people in poorer countries and less developed countries. And so there was an inequality that we would seek to address. We would seek to raise people out of poverty, provide people with healthcare, provide people with education, so that they could be more like us and we could have a more equal world. Well, now the interesting thing is the growing area of inequality is not between nations but within nations. And so this slide, it's only up to 2012, and in fact, as you track these figures, they become more extreme. But it basically measures the amount of inequality within what are largely very wealthy societies. And you'll see that for Australia, the measure of inequality is not as extreme as it is in the United States or the United Kingdom, but across all of these four very developed nations, we've got increasing degrees of inequality over time. So what you have is increasing experience of people gaining more and a lot of people gaining less. When you think about it, it's some of the reasons for some of the big social upheavals we saw last year with Brexit and with Trump arising, largely related to this notion that there are people within society who are feeling they're not getting the same good deal as other people. So instead of looking across countries, we're now looking within countries and starting to deal with inequality, as well as then looking at poorer nations that also have inequality. So the problem becomes much more complicated than just saying we're going to fix something that happens over there. Now the global response to this has been the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure you're all familiar with and you ought to know well and know all the goals in some detail. And there's a couple of interesting things about the Sustainable Development Goals. One is this assumption underpinning them that development is interconnected and global. And we can no longer just look at what development is required in other countries from a rich perspective, but we actually also have to think about what development's required and change is required in our country. Further, that what change we need is transformational. It can't just be bits of more of the same, but we need to step into a new place to think about the sort of change that's required, a new approach that's really going to require thinking about problems that are wicked, that are complex, that are interconnected, that are global, that involve people's beliefs and views. So if we want to challenge things like inequality for women or exclusion of people with disability or problems with climate change and sustainable development, then we're going to have to think about what's happening both in our country as well as other countries. We're going to have to work with other people, we're going to have to work with ideas and so on. So these are the sort of thinking and ideas that underpins some of the thinking that we've done at the Institute. A couple of other things to mention is this notion of power. So one of the key elements for us in the work that we've explored and the research that we've undertaken at the Institute is to really think about this notion of difference of power between groups and what that actually means in terms of people's ability to make change and to engage in change. There's some good work being done for many years, a lot of it done through some of the feminist research around what power actually means and trying to really distinguish between different types of power. So I'm not going to get into that in a whole lot of detail except to just refer you to this very short summary where there's a distinction between power within and power with, which might be seen as more positive aspects of power. So the power within, people's belief that they can actually do things, the power with, the people's ability to work together through collective action to actually change things. And the power to, having the resources and the knowledge and the capability to actually make a change, versus power over, when we're talking about hierarchy and domination and a situation where people actually use their power to stop other people changing and being able to achieve the well-being and social change that they're trying to seek. So really trying to understand what power is operating in particular situations has become for us at the Institute one of the key aspects of really trying to understand then how we engage in social change. The other bit I just wanted to give very small mention to is this notion of cultural and value differences. So while this has been a big focus in a lot of other disciplines, particularly leadership, but also in business and management, it hasn't been something that we've picked up in aid and development, except insofar as to talk about training people in appropriate cultural practice. We haven't really thought through, until very recently, I think, the way different culture and values and identities actually make a difference to the way people see and understand change and aspiration and well-being and their own identity. And it speaks then, because values are related to culture, it speaks to a whole range of issues, about how people see relationships, how they understand justice, what risks they're willing to take, what are the ways that they plan for the world. Do they plan very short term, or do they have a culture that actually thinks very long term? So all of these things are very related to people's values and culture, and they have a very direct impact on what happens in aid and development and what people are willing to engage in. And so that becomes critical to then thinking about, well, what sort of change is possible in that situation. So finally, if we put all those together, this really summarises a bit of how we start in terms of then thinking about practice for social change. We need to understand that it's a very complex world. There's no simple answer to engaging and working in social change. And we have to think about things like, where are the tipping points where people might, or organisations or societies might be ready to take change? What's the sort of paths that are available, and what are they dependent upon? And then finally, we also need to think about issues like power and culture and how these come together.